Welcome to the WildAg Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes. Welcome back to the WildAg Podcast. I'm Nate Pfluger, and today I'm joined with the co-host, Dr. Andy Little. And our guest today is Lonnie Shafer from York, Nebraska. And I actually met Lonnie, or didn't meet him, but learned of all of his research on the history of pheasants in Nebraska and really the U.S. in general this last year at our state habitat meeting. And since then, I've learned that Lonnie has written a number of books on the history of pheasants, and I thought he would be a great individual to have on because he has a wealth of knowledge in this area that I would say nobody else comes close to. So I'm looking forward to the discussion today. So with that, Lonnie, would you please introduce yourself and give us a little background?
I'm Lonnie Shafer. I am a native of Nebraska. I grew up in rural Richardson County near Schubert, Nebraska. My dad introduced me to hunting at an early age of 10, and we hunted bobwhite quail, squirrels, rabbits, coyotes. As I was growing up, there was very few pheasants in Richardson County, so once a year he would go to Nuckolls County or Webster County to hunt pheasants. The first pheasants I ever recall seeing were pheasants that he had brought back from his hunting, and I vividly recall him pulling out those two long tail feathers and presenting them to me as a young boy. At age 11, I shot my first pheasant in 1956 in Webster County, and I've been a pheasant hunter for the last 70 years. After high school, I went to Peru State College, got a degree in teaching, and began a teaching career for 40 years in Nebraska. I taught at Orleans, Nebraska for 8 years and for 32 years at Exeter, Nebraska. Then I retired in 2006 and gave me more time to pursue pheasant hunting. I also became interested in doing history and study of pheasants. So in 2009, John Farrar for the Nebraska Land magazine wrote an article called Arrival of the Ringneck. In that I found out that in 1911, the Nebraska Game Department pursued a plan to stock the state with pheasants. Since 2011 was coming up, I thought I would put together a history of Nebraska pheasants from 1911 to 2011, resulting in a book that I titled Schafer's Nebraska Pheasant Hunting Almanac. That contains the historical data and statistics about pheasant hunting from 1911 to 2010. In 2008, in my retirement, I had family in South Dakota. I started hunting in South Dakota, and I thought surely someone in South Dakota has put together a book because they're the premier hunting state for pheasants. No one had. So as a result, I started working with Travis Runia and Chad Switzer of the South Dakota Game Department, which culminated in a book in 2019 covering the 100 years of pheasant hunting in South Dakota. Also, since 2012, I've been working on a book that I plan to print next summer called Schafer's Nebraska Pheasant Hunting Season Record Book, which will cover the first 100 years of pheasant hunting in Nebraska. Some of my findings challenge some of the customary data that has been passed down as stocking history. And since Nebraska is about to celebrate their 100th pheasant hunting season, I also took part of that book and presented what I call Nebraska Pheasant Introduction 101, which contains that historical information. This booklet and section 13 of the book will contain the most complete study of the introduction of pheasants in Nebraska to date, and probably the most true story of the introduction. I have compiled these books to preserve the details of the pheasant introduction and the pheasant history in the states of Nebraska and South Dakota.
Oh, that's impressive. That's exciting.
One of the things that I have in the Introduction 101 is a section called New Revelations on the Pheasant Introduction in Nebraska. In 1930, Myron Swinkie wrote a book called The Food Habits of the Ringneck Pheasant in Central Nebraska. In there, he has a section on the pheasant introduction into Nebraska and other Missouri Valley states. Unfortunately, it contains some errors that I have found, and this has been handed down as the standard. The first thing he said was that the first occurrence of pheasants in Nebraska were stragglers that came into the state from Kansas in 1900 to 1904. Actually, there were individuals and sportsman groups that were releasing pheasants in Nebraska in the 1890s. Second, he said that the state of Nebraska began a stalking plan in 1915. Actually, it was 1911 when that occurred. And the third thing he presents is that no very large number of pheasants were ever brought into the state of Nebraska, probably not more than 500 pairs. My research has revealed that at least the state had released 3,946 pheasants. Somehow I would like for this new standard to be published and before the public, and I thought that this would be a good time to do that.
Sure. Yeah, that's exciting. Wow, man. I'll be honest, I'm really excited for the episode. One, just because I'm a pheasant hunter myself. Two, I'm doing pheasant research with Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, and you noted this being the 100th anniversary for pheasant hunting here in the state, so I think it's a pretty notable year. And our pheasant project is actually wrapping up this year, and so it's part of I think it's a really nice culmination to a lot of these conversations. And I'm personally excited to read some of your material you've put together as well, aside from what we're going to talk about today, and just to learn a lot more about the history of pheasants here in Nebraska. Because my time is with pheasant hunting dates back to when I was a kid in Pennsylvania, and kind of a similar probably story of how you got started. And my dad took me out pheasant hunting, but there a lot of the birds were stocked, and I remember actually hunting Szechuan pheasants in Christmas tree fields that they had in South Central Pennsylvania, and so that was kind of an interesting experience. I still remember that vividly as a kid, but I remember my dad would always talk about when he was a kid and going out to the back 40, the cornfield behind the house, and him and his dad getting a limit of pheasants and then walking right back to the house. And so times have changed, obviously, and we'll probably dive into that a little more detail shortly. But yeah, thank you so much. That's exciting. I'm looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, just meeting with Lonnie before the episode and even on the drive in, I mean, it's pretty mind-blowing the amount of research and time and effort he's put into his books, and just where he's gone to the lengths to get the information. So backing up a little bit, Lonnie, before we start talking more about the releases in the U.S. and in Nebraska, I just want to focus on pheasants in general. What countries are they actually native to, and where did they come from originally?
In doing my research, I've learned that what you need to understand is what is called true pheasants. And true pheasants are made up of, I'm not very good at Latin, so here we go, Phanasius colloquius and Phanasius varicolor. And the colloquius group has 5 family groups, and each family group has subspecies from 2 to 17, making 30 subspecies. And varicolor has 1 family group with 4 subspecies. And I'm not going to list all these, but it goes across 19 Asian countries. It goes from basically Georgia near the Black Sea all the way to the island of Japan across Asia. And the 6 family groups are basically divided by the male plumage, the neck color, the wing covert color, and the rump color. And I'm just going to talk about two of these because these are the ones that we're going to be talking about most, is the Chinese ringneck pheasant, also called the torquatus, which means a color. Is that what that Latin word means? This pheasant has a white ringneck, has a gray wing coverts, and a greenish ray rump. The other one that I'm going to talk about mostly is the Clocus family, and it has no ringneck. It has buff wing coverts and a rust rump. Now, to relate the story of how those pheasants got to Nebraska, I've made an ancestry chart that tracks them from Asia to Nebraska. So to begin with, we're going to go back to ancient times. The Clocus region is on the east end of the Black Sea, and today that country is called the Republic of Georgia. The ancient Greeks colonized that area, took that pheasant back to Greece. The ancient Romans conquered the Greeks, brought that pheasant to Italy in their European Empire, and eventually it crossed into England. So the Clocus pheasant reaches England no later than the 1100s. During that time, the English called it the black-necked pheasant, and that was a pheasant they had for about 600 years. In the 1700s, they were trading with China, and they came into contact with the Chinese ringneck pheasant. They crossbred those. True pheasants are so closely related that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. As a result, the English ringneck pheasant became the most prominent pheasant in England in the 1800s. In 1887, a man by the name of Rutherford Stuyvesant in New Jersey successfully stocked that pheasant on his estate in New Jersey. So now you have this hybrid pheasant, the Clocus and the Chinese, living in eastern United States. Other states saw that, and they wanted pheasants, so game farms started and sold pheasants to pheasant enthusiasts. So eventually, from eastern United States, they arrived in Nebraska in the late 1800s, the early 1900s. And so that's the story of the Clocus pheasant getting to Nebraska. On the other side of the ancestry chart is the Chinese pheasant coming in as a pure strain from China. In 1880s, Owen Denny was the consul general for the United States in Shanghai, China. He came into contact with this pheasant and thought it would be a good pheasant for his home state of Oregon, so he started shipping those pheasants to Oregon. Again, game farms were established because other states created an interest in wanting pheasants, and some of those pheasants were sold into Nebraska. As a result, our pheasant to Nebraska is a hybrid pheasant. In 2020, there was a research carried out that said that these were the two DNAs in our pheasant here in Nebraska today.
That's really cool. That's really impressive. It's amazing. All the history of that. And I think that's, so as we're kind of talking about today, I think one of the exciting parts is, and you were just mentioning about from like bringing them over to New Jersey and then eventually kind of making a way across. What was kind of the allure for most people, and probably even still today from a hunting standpoint, that people said, hey, I really want to bring this bird here because of, from a recreational standpoint or just, viewing, of that bird? I'm just curious, is it, kind of what you've seen and read?
Well, I think it was mainly for hunting purposes. I read a lot of newspaper articles from the 1880s and stuff, and the pheasant was kind of the bird of the royalty. Okay. And I think there was a lot of interest in the United States in the pheasant, and we'll get into this later, but as the prairie chicken was disappearing, they wanted pheasants as a game bird. That there was a lot of interest in hunting back then, as even as today.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think many individuals, obviously many many individuals haven't taken the time to go as in-depth as Lonnie has in his research.
Just knowing that history, when you just think of kind of, what most people think of, they came from Asia somewhere is kind of what, the initial assumption is. It's like, but actually going back and looking at that, it's really exciting.
Yeah. So obviously their native range in Asia is pretty large, as you stated, Lonnie. Is the pheasants that we have here today that you're describing, is their native habitat similar to what we find or we historically had in Nebraska, or is it completely different?
There's an interesting story behind what I've learned about the native habitat. In 1910, there was a multimillionaire businessman back east that had a great deal of interest in pheasants. So this is 1910. He set aside $60,000 to carry out an expedition of the pheasant. And William Beebe was selected to head up this expedition. He took a photographer with him, and they went to England, China, Japan, India, Borneo, and other countries where pheasants were known or believed to exist. The result of that, over the next 10 years, he carried out this study, and he wrote a 4-volume book, not only about true pheasants, but whatever is considered as the pheasant family. And this is what a general statement he made about the pheasant's habitat. Pheasants there primarily use woodlands with dense, shrubby undergrowth, edge habitat, and brushy country. And then specifically about the Chinese pheasant, he had this to say, that they lived in 3 types of country. First, dense reed beds along riverbanks. Second, low rolling hills covered with scrub oak, chestnut, and pines, or dense grassed undergrowth interspersed with small farms. And third, the flat fields of rice, wheat, and millet near the edges of those paddies. He also wrote in his book that the Chinese and the Clocus pheasant had been introduced all over the world and has thrived in every temperate climate of Europe and America. And so that's, in general, the habitat there.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, and I think that's, one of the things, and we can dive into this a little bit later, but obviously we, have discussed in kind of at length, and what a lot of my work in my lab is focused on is how do we're probably not going to get back to the peaks habitat conditions in, say, the 50s and 60s when we saw a lot of pheasants in Nebraska, but how do we kind of get back to that, to a point where we have that habitat diversity, and obviously understanding the history of where they came from, that landscape structure, and what, how they thrived over in China and England and a lot of other locations is really important to kind of drive, the landscape today, and thinking about they're obviously sustainable. They're, may have sustainable populations. I don't know what the current history is now, if the populations are fairly stable in some of those locations over in China and England and other locations over there. But that's something that I think is, as the global landscape, we'll say, is changing. I think it's important to kind of understand that history, and I appreciate, Lonnie, you sharing that history, because I think that's such a critical aspect to understand where they thrive, what landscapes they thrived in, and how to basically find ways to, provide that today, at least to a point, and then finding innovative ways working with our farmers to be able to help them optimize their farm profitability, because that's usually one of the challenges of, reducing that habitat to maximize production. So.
Well, and the thing that I kind of locked on to is when he was describing the habitat, I mean, it sounds like what we would think of prime pheasant habitat too, right?
Yeah.
So it sounded like wetlands, so reed beds along riverbanks. You talked about small grains, small interspersed farms on the countryside. Yep. And historically, when we had our large pheasant numbers, I mean, that's what the landscape was, right?
Yeah.
And as we've seen those small grains disappear, maybe farm sizes grow, right? So there's less farms, but bigger farms, bigger fields, less edge habitat. I mean, that's when we start to see, at least here in Nebraska, the decline of the pheasant. So it's definitely interesting. That far back, we knew what good habitat was.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
Do you know, Lonnie, in your research, are they heavily managed in their native countries for hunting or anything like that?
Well, I did a little research on that, and it's kind of like the states. If you want a pheasant in Nebraska, you have to go through what the state regulations are, and I think that's the same is true of these countries. I did do a little research on China, and I asked, is recreational hunting available there? And basically not. The gun laws are very restrictive. If you want a pheasant hunt in China today, you probably have to go through some agent to find a place to hunt. I did look into Georgia a little bit, and they are going through some of the same things we are about conservation of these pheasants. And I think it would be very restrictive probably to hunt these areas. But since there's 19 different countries, there's probably 19 different regulations to do so.
Yeah, and I think one thing I wanted to mention, because this always comes up, I always have this question, and is yes, they were introduced over here, but obviously pheasants have been in the United States for quite a while. And so one of the things that I hear from some individuals is kind of the native versus not native conversation. And so I was curious, kind of based on the history and of kind of, learning over literally like decades and decades of all the work that's been occurring for pheasants across the world. So basically, where you mentioned earlier, Asia was really kind of the central place where pheasants, kind of originated at. And so essentially, like in the England and some of those areas, they were just essentially introduced over time, and they've kind of habituated to that area. And so I guess, do you have any thoughts on that? Because that's something that always comes up quite a bit. I have people say, well, should we be managing for pheasants because they're not a native species? My personal opinion is, especially because we're losing habitat over here, I look at it as we're losing habitat, and they are a bird that we see around, say, CRP fields and things like that. So they're likely benefiting other species, not just benefiting pheasants directly. So, and I don't know, Nate, if you have any other thoughts on that from questions you get or comments. So.
Well, and I'll let Lonnie go if he has a point. But yeah, Andy, I mean, you're right. They thrive in native habitat within Nebraska. So, I mean, if somebody wants to manage for pheasants, you're still going to be putting native habitat out there, which is going to benefit all of our other native species. Yeah. So, I mean, where I stand. I think we should manage habitat and definitely look to manage for the pheasant. But I'll let Lonnie chime in.
Well, one of the things on our outline is, how does their native habitat compare to the Nebraska habitat? Well, this is what one writer wrote about when they were first introduced in Nebraska. Grain fields in those days were small, and grassy fence lines numerous, road ditches when unmowed, shelter belts and rows of trees planted in long windbreaks proliferated. Many farmers plowed around bushy areas, ignored weeds at the field's edge, and left grain stubble standing through the winter. From a conservation standpoint, farming was delightfully sloppy.
Delightfully sloppy.
Ringnecks thrived amid this mosaic of crops and cover that defined rural America at that time.
That's a good way to sum that up.
I mean, that sounds like an awesome picture that you'd see on the wall, just 30, 40 pheasants in the picture.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. I know it's always a question I get or a comment that I've had people ask about. And just kind of reiterate my point of view on it is, we're getting habitat out there. And I think in general, one of the things I'm really passionate about is we're losing habitat. We're seeing declines, not only in game birds, but obviously non-game birds as well, and other species. We also have water quality and quantity problems. We have soil health issues. And so all of those things are collectively tied to this bigger question of how do we kind of, balance conservation and our production ag systems. And so one of the things I'm looking into is, hey, how, if we're putting that habitat out there, what are all the other species that you're actually benefiting by doing that? And then are there also impacts to the soil health now because you're putting that habitat out there, to the water quality and quantity issues that we're facing in Nebraska, and really not just Nebraska, but around the country right now. And so I think it's just an opportunity to kind of have a larger discussion around how do we optimize our systems in efficient ways so they can be productive, but at the same time we can balance out and benefit soil, water, and wildlife. So,
Lonnie, you kind of touched on it earlier. You mentioned that pheasants started coming into the U.S. in the late 1800s and then probably made it to Nebraska by late 1800s as well, early 1900s. In your research, can you touch on how many individuals are thought to have been brought to Nebraska?
I just want to back up a little bit here on the pheasants that were brought into the United States and Nebraska and Midwest, South Dakota, which I'm most familiar with. In the 1700s, there were some gentlemen on the East Coast who tried to introduce pheasants even into the 1800s, but none of those were successful. They were trying to introduce them as a game bird, and the real success came in 1881 and 1882 with Owen Denny. He is credited with the first successful introduction of pheasants in the United States. In 1882, he shipped 24 pheasants to his brother's farm in Oregon, and 17 of them were hens, 7 were roosters, and over the next 10 years, they spread throughout the Willamette Valley, an area of about 150 by 40 miles wide. And Oregon had their first pheasant hunting season in 1892, and that really triggered interest in states like Nebraska and South Dakota to want to have pheasants. And we already mentioned Rutherford Stuyvesant. He brought them in 1887 in New Jersey, and that also created an interest in other states to want to have pheasants. We also need to talk about game farms. Mm-hmm. Game farms were the main suppliers of pheasants and pheasant eggs for stocking. There were several game farms in eastern United States and several in the Pacific Northwest of Washington and Oregon. 2 of the biggest was the Evans Game Propagating Farm in Illinois. And he was considered as a master in the art of breeding pheasants. I found an article in 1907 where he had 4,000 English ringneck pheasants for sale. Wow. And he sold pheasants for the next 20 years to those who were interested. Individuals could buy them, sportsmen's group, and, of course, state game departments. On the West Coast, the Simpson Pheasant Farm in Corvallis, Oregon, was considered the largest operation west of the Mississippi River. He was also considered an expert in raising pheasants. I found the records for Oregon selling pheasants in 1908 and 1910, and Simpson alone sold pheasants to 28 different states, including Nebraska and South Dakota. The earliest documentation for pheasants in Nebraska came from individuals in the 1890s. The very first one I found was George Miller, who released several pairs near Fort Calhoun. In 1895, sportsmen from Hastings were releasing pheasants in Little Blue Valley. 1897, Aaron Wall of Loop City was raising pheasants for introduction. In 1889, a group of men in Chadron purchased pheasants and released them near Chadron Creek. And basically the same thing was happening in South Dakota. In 1909, Bert Hageman, Harlan Packard, and Henry Shackle of Redfield successfully introduced pheasants for the first time, and there were other individuals that followed up in 1909 and 1910.
So it's obvious that the first introductions, they were on purpose. It's not like they just escaped from somebody's pen. I mean, the people wanted to see them out there on the landscape.
Yeah. In Iowa, they claim that's what happened, is that they escaped from where a guy was raising pheasants. But in Nebraska, they were bringing them in on purpose for propagation purposes.
Do you know, is there any records of like what it cost per bird back then?
Yes. It basically was $3 per pheasant.
Okay.
hens were probably a little more expensive than roosters because they would, in the 20s, Nebraska was buying 1 rooster and 2 hens for release.
Oh, okay.
I wonder what that is today, because that seems expensive. I mean, I don't know the correlation, but I mean...
Well, I would say that it was probably 10 times that amount today. It'd probably be $30 in our currency, yeah.
Well, and you mentioned earlier, obviously, people who are passionate about having pheasants and pheasant hunting, there's also, you said, a wealth status to some level, I think probably historically back, decades ago. And so in theory, part of it was probably people who were more well off or more likely probably to spend that money to invest in putting pheasants out in their farms or, preserves or whatever that they had. So,
and not to get too far off down a different trail here, but historically when folks were releasing pheasants and trying to introduce them, were there other species that were targeted as well, or was it mainly just pheasants?
No. In 1907, a collection was taken up to introduce Hungarian partridges, and they collected enough money to buy 124 pairs. In 1911, the legislature appropriated $5,000 to the Game and Fish Commission, and it just said in the law for propagation purposes. I found a 1911 newspaper article that said that they set up a hatchery, which I would say was more of a game farm, at Antelope Park in Lincoln to raise game birds. And they purchased, at that time, another 50 pair of Hungarian partridges, 100 pair of English ringneck pheasants, some golden pheasants, some silver pheasants, some Lady Amherst pheasants, and 15 pairs of ducks and geese. And later I found that they also had swinehole pheasants and Reeves pheasants. And you were talking about cost. They were paying $4.50 per pair for the Hungarian partridges, $6 for the English pheasants per pair. Golden and silver pheasants were $15 a pair, and a Lady Amherst pheasant pair was $30, based on the fact that the order was for 100 English pheasants. Obviously, that was their target game bird. I think many of these other birds were just there for show and ornamentation. It was more like open to the public, and I would call it kind of a zoo-like atmosphere where people could just come in and observe what they had at that time. And there were other cities like Denver that had similar situations.
That's really interesting. First, I was thinking Antelope Park. Boy, imagine what it looked like then versus what it looks like today. It's a very different. I'm trying to picture that. But and then secondly, to your point, I think again, just to me, pheasants, they're such an ornate bird and just that obviously is the allure, I think, from the attractiveness of them is how, basically how pretty of a bird they are. And that's, I think, to your point of having different ones. And I could totally see that from a viewing standpoint. That was probably it was pretty a big hit probably at that point in time. People were really interested to see, hey, look at these golden pheasants. Like that's something I've never seen before. I'm curious to see what that looks like.
Yeah, if you lived in Nebraska your whole life and you just get the chance to see a golden pheasant, your mind's probably blown a little bit.
Yeah, I think some people just bought them because they like the beauty of them. And I also learned that they started showing them at these poultry shows. Poultry shows was a big thing back in the early 1900s. There would be poultry shows in New York and Norfolk and other cities around the state. And by 1910, they had a division of pheasants.
That's really cool.
They showed them and who could have the best pair of pheasants.
That's really interesting. Wow.
So, Lonnie, do we have an exact date when conservation organizations or maybe the game and fish organizations got involved with introduction efforts?
Well, the first thing I ran across was in the it'd be 1905 to 1907. I ran across an article that said that half 100 or so pheasants were brought in around 1906 from donated funds. And several years ago, I got this email from Jim Cunningham, and he said that his great-grandfather, Burlington Cunningham, had received a pair of live pheasants from the Nebraska Game Commission in 1905. So that makes a connection. And in 1907, another guy from Chicago, a sportsman, donated 3 pheasants to the game department. And the newspaper article had this to say: though there were inadequate protection for wild game at that time, many of the birds survived and raised broods of young. And they also said they would hope to stock Nebraska with pheasants so that sportsmen would have them to hunt later on. And then I found one other follow-up on this in 1907. The fish superintendent at Gretna had some English pheasants that he was planning to release in March of that year. But that was the only thing I could find there. But then the real plan started in 1911. And it didn't have a name, so when I wrote my book, I called it the Nebraska Ringneck Pheasant Stocking Plan. And it started in 1911 when the legislature appropriated that $5,000. And it would take them, I think, 3 phases and 17 years to execute their plan. In phase 1, they were raising pheasants, as we said, at Antelope Park. And they started releasing them in 1912. Between 1912 and 1915, they released 370 pheasants. And then the legislature decided that it wasn't successful enough to keep pouring money into it, but that didn't stop the game department. They continued their efforts. They moved to the state fairgrounds and continued to try to raise pheasants and released some in 1915. Now, you got to realize that this is the time of World War I, and so I think this had an effect on what was going on in the stocking of pheasants. But in 1907, I call this guy the Abraham Lincoln of the Nebraska pheasant program. His name was George Coaster. He became the commissioner of the game department, and he would serve in that position for the next 8 years. During his tenure, he worked diligently to revive and continue the stocking program. And he also was very successful in making the game department profitable. He saw that the licenses were bought and the fines were for people who were violating the law or paying their fees. And by 1923, the game department was $100,000 in the black. And so I think that was his leverage. So he went to the game department, or he went to the legislature and asked for some money again. And in 1919, they appropriated $15,000. And the main purpose of the law was to stock pheasants in areas of the state where grasshoppers were a pest. And I think he took advantage of that. And so in 1920, he bought 70 pheasants and released them in groups of 3. In 1921, he bought another 200 pheasants for distribution. And then in 1922, he was able to purchase 1,770 pheasants for release. And the following year, he bought another 1,536 pheasants plus 4,608 eggs for distribution across the state. So by 1924, there was probably not the need to buy any more pheasants. But in 1926, which I call the third phase, they decided that since central Nebraska had a large population of pheasants, it was cheaper to pay $1 per pheasant to be trapped and redistributed, than rather than paying $3 to buy an out-of-state pheasant. So in 1926, in Howard, Sherman, and Buffalo County, trappers provided them with 15,121 pheasants.
Wow.
In 1927, another 28,632 pheasants were trapped and distributed to over 70 different counties in the state. And so that was also 1927 when they had met their goal and allowed for the first pheasant hunting season in the state.
That's really cool. Huh. Wow, that's impressive. And this is exactly what we have Lonnie on to talk about the history, because this is really impressive to understand, because this is stuff I was not aware of, and exciting to learn in that long-term history. So, yeah, I appreciate that.
And in talking with you, Lonnie, so the Game and Fish, whatever they were named at that point, they raised and released birds, they trapped and relocated them, but then they also, correct me if I'm wrong, gave eggs or maybe poults to folks who wanted to raise them and then release them themselves. Is that correct?
The year that they bought, that I found, was 1923 when they bought those 4,600 eggs. They asked people, do you want pheasants? And if you do, make an application. And then if your application is corrected, then we will provide you with maybe a dozen to 16 eggs. And the records show that they divided those 4,600 into 334 different batches to be distributed. So you would get the eggs. They shipped them directly, like from the Evans Game Farm in Illinois. They said, okay, Nate wants pheasants. Okay, so we'll send them directly to him. So he sends the eggs. He would put them under regular barn chickens to hatch.
Oh, okay.
And then he would release them 8 weeks when they're 8 weeks old into the public. So basically the eggs went directly from the game farm to the person that they had approved to get the eggs. You raised the eggs, and you released them when they were about 8 weeks old.
I wonder what that application looks like.
Yeah.
Do you have a chicken to put these under?
Yeah.
Well, I think they were more concerned about your habitat.
Okay.
What kind of habitat you had to release them in.
That was my question I was going to ask. So thinking about them doing these releases, I'm assuming there's science behind of these decisions, and obviously the management of I should say not the management, the raising of these birds. But then to your point, we're not just gonna blindly ship them to people without some level of I don't know if you want to say guarantee, but hopeful success that they get there, they get released, and they actually help propagate a population there, as opposed to just kind of mailing them around and then you're just wasting money. I assume there's some science or some kind of thought and strategy behind that.
Yes, and I think it was kind of like taking an oath.
Sure.
I will do this, and they were well aware of what was going on in other states.
Sure.
Other states were doing this as well.
Yeah,
So this wasn't just isolated in Nebraska. Although I didn't find that South Dakota had bought eggs, but there were other states that were doing this, Illinois and Ohio and other states that were doing this same thing.
Yeah.
Well, and kind of like you've said in all your research, I mean, there's people that were out there doing stuff that wasn't necessarily documented
that's true.
in writing too, so it's hard to put an exact figure on it.
That's a good point.
In your research, when did conservation organizations stop raising and releasing birds then?
Okay, my main research that I focused on was from the 1880s to the 1920s, but in the 1930s, Nebraska did build 3 different game farms. Not only did they raise pheasants, but they raised other birds. For example, chuckers was one that they experimented with, but they had 3 game farms, one in Madison County, one in Knox County, and one in Dundee County. And according to the records, from 1937 through 1946, they released 130,429 pheasants. Also during this same time period, there was what was called the Pittman-Robertson Project, which they would give eggs to individuals who would raise young birds and release them like they did in 1923. And that program from 1939 to 1944, they released over 40,000 pheasants. In 1960s, Mel Steen became the director of the commission, and he introduced what was called modern game management, and he told them that he thought it was a waste of time and money to continue to raise pheasants, that they ought to be focusing more on habitat. He called it environment at that particular time. So those game farms closed down by 1960, and then the game farm was established at Sacramento Wilcox. Now, they continued to provide young pheasants. They hatched them, and then they would give them to individuals for release. Kind of a side story here. In 1976, I shot a pheasant that had a band on it. And so I sent it in to the game department, and they said this pheasant had been released on August 5th, 1976, 2.5 miles south of Exeter in Fillmore County, and that's where I lived at that particular time, in Exeter. And they also said in the letter that approximately 84,000 day-old pheasants was purchased by the game department in 1976 and released at the age of 7 weeks with these bands. I shot that pheasant in a neighboring farm on November 7th of that year, so he only survived 3 months after his. And I also read that in the 1980s, they were still releasing pheasants. 4,000 birds were released, and 35,000 day-old chicks were being distributed. So I don't know exactly when they stopped those programs, but that's as far as I could find that.
Into the 1980s then?
Yeah, at least into the 1980s.
What do you know when they started doing more like today? They'll stock from buy birds at game farms and then stock WMAs. Do you know kind of when that started?
In 2012, they started doing it for the youth season.
Okay.
The following year, 2013, they did it for what they called families at Thanksgiving time. So that's how long that's been going on.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's, like you said, Lonnie, those releases are pretty much just for opportunities, right?
Sure.
To get youth into the outdoors, and then around the holidays, get family outdoors. The goal isn't necessarily reintroduction for those.
Those are basically for hunting, and I hunt one close by to York, and by January, those birds are gone.
Yeah.
They're either been shot or predators have gotten them or something. They're just not there.
That's how it was growing up back in the 90s in Pennsylvania. It was a similar type of thing where, you'd see a lot of birds that were obviously came from a game farm and they were just hanging around the roads, and they usually would not last very long after they were released out there. So...
No, not at all. And so, Andy, you might be able to speak on this a little more, but what does the current research say about pheasant introduction success? Because I think you've done a little work on that here in Nebraska, right?
Yeah, so, and I'll let Lonnie speak a little more into this than myself. But we did a project. I was really came in on the end of it several years ago, where basically, there's different philosophies on kind of raising them, and so one of the things that I've gotten to learn a little more about is people would raise them in surrogators, and then they would release them at sites. Sometimes those surrogators are actually at the site that they release them at. Others are maybe off-site, and then they would take and move the birds at different points in the year. The project that I was just again on the periphery of the end of it. Because one of the other faculty members, he had left the university. What they were doing were they again had surrogators, and basically it's a small pen that they're raising those birds in, and the point is then they'll eventually kind of soft release them out. into those fields that are around where they're at. And so a part of that question was, one of the questions was, could you offset the declines in pheasants by raising them and releasing them at different times in the year? And so they were releasing birds about 9 weeks of age, and they usually occur kind of like late July time frame, and then they had another release period, which was in September. And then the goal was to see, did they make it to hunting season? That was the first question. And then 2, did you have any birds that would make it throughout that next breeding season, with the point of trying to be able to offset the population declines. And so in general, populations, once they were released, kind of to Lonnie's earlier point, they didn't really survive very long out there. A lot of the birds, because they were very used to being in that penned facility. But then there were some that did make it, and there were some birds that nested out there. Ultimately, it was not a lot, and because most of them were, died from, whether it be from hunting, predators, a lot of other factors. So they usually didn't end up making it a real long time out there. And so in theory, to offset the population decline, that's probably not necessarily going to be the long-term only strategy. What I always say is go back to habitat. And if we're releasing them, and if the goal simply is, hey, we want to be able to have a huntable population, we're already doing that. And we just talked about that on WMAs. But then the second point is, focus a lot on the habitat management side of things. And if you can build that, working with private lands biologists, you can definitely have a strategy to help boost those local populations that you may already have. Again, it's to not say that will never work, because there's obviously cases where it has worked, but the long-term strategy, I think if you're investing, resources, I think the habitat's really the critical piece. So, but Lonnie, I'll let you maybe jump into that a little bit too.
The studies that I have seen, the most cost-effective is to create habitat. That, if you want pheasants, you need to have a place for them to live, breed, and be protected from predators and so forth. I've looked at several different studies. I have one here about South Dakota that Anthony Life carried out. I met him when I was doing some research on the South Dakota stuff, but they radio collared pheasants and turned them loose. And here was what his conclusion or their study was. Pen raised hens suffer nearly total mortality shortly after being released, making them easy pickings for predators. And the conclusion was that it was a largely waste of resources. And so South Dakota doesn't release pheasants. I've heard rumors, the people saying, well, why don't we do like South Dakota? Well, they don't do that. They don't release pheasants. The last release pheasants that they did make was they captured some wild pheasants and then moved them to where they wanted them. But they don't do that, and they're not the only state. Other states have carried out these studies. Even in the 1950s, there was a book written by Levi Moeller, and he says it's not cost-effective. It costs more than it's worth, and there's, like you say, there's seldom, a huntable population by these released birds, no matter when it is.
Yeah.
Whether it's young in the fall or hens in the spring, it just doesn't work today.
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of that too is, and we've had some of these discussions. John Carroll, who's a former professor here and just retired actually here just a few days ago. Part of some of his past research was actually looking at diet analysis of birds that were pen reared versus wild, and obviously the gut microbiome ends up being definitely different between the pen rear, because they're usually on pelletized feed versus the wild birds are eating insects and other types of seeds and things like that. And part of that conversation goes into, again, it all depends on your objective and what you're wanting to do. If you're hunting them like we're doing, like say WMAs, or other state recreational areas, during that fall season where they would release them for youth season or for, around Christmas, or I should say Thanksgiving, Christmas time. If that's the goal, then releasing them like they're doing is a pretty good strategy. So you have some kids can get out there and harvest some birds. But if your goal really is to augment the population and help maybe increase the population over time, again, back to the habitat point, not necessarily keep harping on it, that to me is the best investment of your limited resources. That's where you're going to see the broader change. And it really goes back to the earlier discussion we just started on here today. What did the habitat look like, back then, and what does it look like today? It obviously has changed dramatically. And I think that's an important perspective to think about, because obviously the resources that pheasants have today versus what they had even 50 years ago are dramatically different. And I think that definitely can affect, based on past research, the population sustainability. That's just a fact. So anyway, that's kind of, again, depending on your objective as a landowner and what your management goals are. I think that's something to always consider.
I would have to agree. So moving forward here, Lonnie, is this coming year the 100th year of a legal pheasant hunting season in Nebraska, or is that next year?
No, it will be this fall. This will be the 100th season, and fortunately, we've had consecutive annual seasons for the last 99 years.
It's impressive.
Yeah, definitely impressive. So kind of before there was an actual legal hunting season, are there any records of people trying to and or harvesting birds before that season was in place?
Well, unfortunately, there were criminals back then, as there are today. But when they first started releasing pheasants in 1895, the Hastings group went to the legislature and said, we want a law to protect these birds that we're going to release. And so they passed a law, and here's what they did. There will be a fine of not less than $50, nor more than $100 if you get caught shooting a pheasant or taking a pheasant. And if you can't pay the fine, you will spend days in the county jail at the rate of $2 per day.
Oh, wow.
So if you couldn't pay a $100 fine, you would have to spend 50 days.
Huh.
But that didn't stop everybody, and that law continued right up until they renewed it as time went on. I did find that in 1922, 2 Central City men were fined $130 for killing a pheasant. In 1923, 3 Grand Island men were charged $342.70, which was court expense as well. In 1922, there was an article in the Valentine newspaper that said, since these birds have been let loose, however, hunters are becoming rather restless, and reports are coming in that many of the pheasants are being killed. However, in some localities, bunches are banding together in an effort to help the state carry out the hopes of protecting the pheasants. Huh. So, yes, there were some that violated the law, and evidently some were caught and paid the severe penalty.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. So, I mean, there was definitely an excitement for that season to open up. I mean, the social outlook was probably pretty positive, right, once the season opened?
Yes. In 1924, I found this in South Dakota. It said, South Dakota hunters declared pheasant hunting to be some of the greatest sport they had ever enjoyed. And in 1934, in the Outdoor Nebraska, it says, pheasant hunting has become a great pastime in Nebraska. As far as the first hunting season, it was 3 days long, and it was in 2 counties, Wheeler County and Sherman County. And it was kind of a process to go through. The county board had to say, we have a surplus of pheasants. They're overstocked. And then the game department had to agree. So evidently these 2 counties were accepted. And it said that in the newspaper article, hunters from every section of the state and from Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, and South Dakota came to Nebraska to hunt.
Wow.
Non-residents paid $25 for a hunting license. approximately 5,000 pheasants were killed by 2,000 hunters in that first season.
In 3 days?
And then Frank O'Connor, who was the commissioner, has quoted as saying, "The birds killed were hardly missed. The big surprise was how difficult the hunters had in finding birds and killing them."
Those are the good old days, huh? That just doesn't even seem realistic to me.
That's true, yeah. Wow.
So the season was 3 days, and they harvested over 5,000 birds in 2 counties.
Right.
That's incredible.
That is wild. So, and I was just going to ask, so that was the first season, and then seasons after that, did they still do that county by county rule, or was it more open up then?
Well, it's expanded more and more counties. I think 28, there was like 8 counties, and then by 1937, the whole state was open.
Yeah, and I think one of the things in, the pheasant hunting, we'll use that as an illustration. It definitely helps also provide to those rural economies, where you think about back then, boy, just a few days of people coming here from all those different states. That kind of reminds me a little bit of deer season, and a lot of people come from out of state. I think it was Matt Steffel up in Chadron as a biologist that came in Parks a few years ago. He mentioned to me that he had counted, I think it was 39 different license plates during deer season up there the one year. And just kind of as a good illustration that, it definitely can have a big impact to local communities across the state, hunting in general, but pheasant hunting, I'm sure back then was a pretty big boom for a lot of those small communities. So,
well, I grew up in the 60s, and that was true of Nebraska in the 60s during the soil bank era.
Oh,
there
sure.
was a lot of out-of-state hunters that came into the state during that time period.
Yeah.
And just to clarify, the soil bank era, that's early CRP, right? Is that what you're referring to?
That was the late 1950s and the early 1960s. There was a land set-aside program at that particular time, but it would only lasted for about 10 years.
Okay. Yeah. But they were putting it into perennial habitat.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. So then the name changed.
Yeah, the plans then was from 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
Okay. That's
so in those early seasons, what did the bag limit look like? Could you harvest roosters and hens?
Well, at first it was just roosters, but from 1930 to 1941, there was a hen season. Most of those were one hen, but in 1933, 35, and 37, they allowed 2 hens. And then in the 1960s, when Steen was in the director, he said there was a surplus, so we had a hen season in the 60s for about 4 years, but it's quit, I think, in 1967, and we haven't had one since. But it was mainly roosters, and, we talked about possession and daily limit. When the first seasons came along, daily limit and the possession limit was the same. And South Dakota was very similar. And one of the reasons is they didn't want people double dipping. They didn't want people to go out and shoot 5 pheasants in the morning and then go out and shoot another 5 in the afternoon.
Sure.
And that way, once you had 5 pheasants, you had your possession. But in the 1940s, which I call the golden years, in the mid-1940s, they were harvesting 2 million pheasants per year. And so they doubled from 5 to 10 to possession. But then after that peak, they went back to single possession daily limit. And then in the 1950s and 60s, when the soil bank came along, then they really started increasing the possession limit. It went from triple, in some cases quadruple. You could harvest 4 pheasants, but you could have a possession limit of 16. And since, 1994, we have settled on 3 for a daily limit and 12 for a possession limit.
Well, and you mentioned, not being able to harvest hens. I remember hunting out in Alma, Nebraska. It's been a few years ago, but I remember getting to the end of a CRP field, and of course, my luck, it was just a whole group of hens jumped up as opposed to having any roosters there, and so I was like, I can't do anything. So,
and it's just crazy to try to wrap my head around there being a season for hens.
Oh yeah,
just because there were so many of them. It's just so hard.
I hunted in the 60s, and my wife's family lived in Hayes County. And so in January, I could shoot hens, but I just had a terrible time convincing myself to do it. But I did shoot one legal hen in 1967.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of in general, from a wildlife management standpoint, I know has been a long, ongoing conversation for a lot of different species, not just game birds only. I know in Pennsylvania, growing up as a kid, doe hunting, for example, I remember in the rifle season, we had a 2-week season. And we had basically 2 weeks of buck only, and then you'd have 3 days of doe hunting only. And that was because there was a lot of concern that we were going to overharvest the doe population. But what actually happened is we saw really a skyrocket in the doe population to the point where I remember deer hunting as a kid, and you'd see 30 deer and see one buck and a small little 4-point or whatever, and then the rest were all does. Eventually that changed back in I think it was around like early 2000s in Pennsylvania, and has been kind of the same since, where now it's concurrent buck and doe for most areas of the state now. So the point is that out of that, there's been this kind of back and forth on should you harvest the females of the population, how many, how often, that kind of thing. Because obviously with population increases, decreases, that is always a concern for a lot of folks. So that's interesting.
Exactly. And I mean, even talking with Sam Wilson before and Adam Kester, I mean, managing a population is always a moving target, right? Because there's so many other factors. So
absolutely.
You're constantly kind of taking in new data, reassessing, taking in new data, and then going from there.
Well, and to Lonnie's point, having all this historical information is incredible, because this is not only this type of information, but also the scientific information that's collected by state agencies is so critical to constantly reevaluate every year and understand kind of what potential changes need to happen for bag limits, possession, et cetera. So
we kind of talked about, you said those early days were 3-day seasons. Lonnie, when did we kind of settle in on the season that we have today, which is months long compared to only days?
Well, it started back in the soil bank era, the 50s and 60s. They just continually increased the season to eventually January 31st, and then they backed off from that.
It was adjusted to, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So with all of your research, what you've kind of grown up through, what you've seen pheasant hunting all these years, how do you feel about the future of pheasants and pheasant hunting in Nebraska? What's kind of your outlook on it?
I'm a believer in research, and I think Mel Steen, and he wrote this in 1969, he said, if we cannot save pheasant environment, which they called habitat, we call habitat today, we cannot save the bird. Only when all of us understand and accept the truth can we solve the problems. Only then will we make the necessary efforts to save and improve as many acres as adequate environment and agricultural economics permit. So, and then in the Bergen plan that we have now, it states in there, if pheasant hunters are to have satisfying experiences within these landscapes and to remain satisfied in our current pheasant strongholds, active management will be necessary. So that's kind of where I feel and stand, that we need to support the programs that we have and develop as much habitat as possible.
And you said that was a quote from what year?
Mel Steen in 1969.
Okay. And I mean, that seems to be a common theme that again and again over like podcasts that we've had is people know what the issue is. It's just trying to get the collective to, they might see it and they might understand it, but it might not, again, be economically feasible for them and their operation, right? So that's definitely a struggle that the conservation community has.
Yeah, well, and I think that kind of speaks to the point of and something we've been thinking about in our lab. Yeah, what does the next even 10 to 15 years look like for conservation and working landscapes like Nebraska, let alone 50 plus years from now. And understanding that currently we're, again, as I noted earlier, whether you're talking about pheasants, quail, non-game birds, we're seeing that precipitous decline in those populations, and largely due to a lack of habitat. Obviously, there are other factors, but that's, I would argue, is probably the number one factor for population declines, is the lack of habitat. And so the simple question from what my lab focuses a lot on is, okay, we know that that's the problem, then let's fix the problem. Let's figure out innovative ways to be able to work with farmers, ranchers, to optimize their profitability for their farm and ranch, while at the same time having habitat out there. We know it's not going to be perfect. We understand it's not going to be ripple in the pond type of effect. But ultimately, we have to be able to find innovative solutions to maintain, sustainable populations long term. Otherwise, we're just going to continue down the road to where you have no birds out there. And then you get to a point of having discussions of like, well, do we just, take and release them only? And is that it? Because we don't have any other habitat out there, and we just do it for a short, kind of use season or whatever that may be. Again, I'm a part of the camp of, hey, let's figure out innovative ways to solve this broader challenge. And I think that leverages precision ag, precision conservation technologies, new innovative monitoring technologies that we can really understand if we implement, say a CRP practice here. Can we collect data before and after and really understand like what that practice is doing? In this case, for pheasants and other wildlife. Obviously, not you're thinking about soil health, water quality; those are all additional factors tied into that. And so, really, I guess kind of to tie all this together from my perspective is I think the future of pheasants can be bright. It ultimately is going to be dependent upon finding innovative solutions to address these underlying challenges, because farmers do want to ensure that long-term sustainability of their operation, period. I haven't met one yet that doesn't say that. And so, again, it has to be cost-effective and it has to be beneficial long-term to their operation. And they have so many competing factors that are pressing against them that's where our job as conservation professionals is to make that easier for adoption, reduce those friction points, and then find those innovative solutions that can help them. And in doing that, then you can start seeing these kind of more holistic, if you want to say, based farms where you have sustainable populations of pheasants and other wildlife.
Definitely. So, Lonnie, do you have any advice for landowners or conservation professionals that you would like to share?
For landowners, I would say you have been blessed. Be good stewards of your land. I like the slogan, farm the best, conserve the rest. I would urge them to take advantage of conservation programs when possible. Not only are they good for wildlife and pheasants, but they protect the topsoil from erosion, and they also protect the groundwater and the water quality. Conservation professionals like you, I would say keep up the good work. Persevere. It took 17 years of perseverance by the game department to succeed in introducing pheasants as a game bird. Your work in developing the habitat is the future to keeping pheasants on the landscape in Nebraska. The pheasant, in my opinion, is a phenomenal, rugged bird and can survive on islands of habitat. I've seen that.
Yes, it can.
That's really good.
Yeah,
And that's a good way to sum it up.
Great advice. So when is your next book going to be released, and where can folks go to find books that you've previously published?
Okay, I need the statistics for the upcoming 2026 season, and those will not be released until sometime in the spring of 2027. I've already made arrangements with a printer to have the book printed in the summer of 2027. I have also given the book sales basically to Pheasants, Nebraska Pheasants Forever, and the goal is to have it on their website to be purchased through them, and they will receive the profits from the selling of the book.
That's awesome.
Really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for taking all of the time and dedication to put these books together.
Yeah.
It's definitely a feat, and obviously without you, it wouldn't have got done.
Yeah,
So
that's true.
It's amazing. One other thing that I wanted to bring up before we close here, and then you guys can throw your closing thoughts and comments out, was, Lonnie, you've kept a hunting journal that I've learned for how many years now?
Since 1969.
Wow.
I kept, when I first got out on my own in 1965, I was in prime, as I said, prime pheasant territory. So I mentally just kept track. The first 3 years, I harvested 100 pheasants, about 33 a year. And so then in 1969, I started a diary, and I have kept a record of all my successful hunts. The dry runs, as I call them, they don't get recorded. But all of my successful hunts since that, and now it's kind of a 3-volume diary.
Wow.
That's all. And that's just
really
something that I've
cool.
learned in talking with Lonnie. I think that's super neat. And
That's
something that I mean, is going to be a goal of mine to start doing, just jotting stuff down. And even if it's not a successful hunt or anything like that, I think it would just be neat for grandkids and kids to look at in the future. Because, I mean, not many people do that. So,
in writing my book, I have a section on there that I call photos over the last 7 decades. And so I have these pictures, and I can go get that diary and I can see what that hunt was about and write a little note about it.
Yeah, well, and that's a great point, because you think about even some of the, back in the 1700s and like some of the documentation, having individuals come over here, we go back and say, well, what did the landscape look like back then? Well, we're obviously living through it right now, and so being able to write that down, take photos, for future generations who will wonder what did it look like, at that time. So that's great to hear that.
This is a side note, but one of the things I've done, I'm a big Yankee fan, and so my son gave me a book that the Yankees, every game for 162, and they pick out one game that over the many seasons and for that particular date. Well, I went back through my diary and I picked out one hunt from everything from about the middle of October to the end of January, which I considered one of the better hunts.
That's awesome.
That's really
and heck,
cool.
who knows? Somebody might use your journal at some point to put in a book or reference. You never know.
True.
Like
That's
Andrew
true.
was saying. But yeah, with that, I mean, I don't think I have any other questions and comments at this point.
Yeah, I really appreciate Lonnie coming on. This has been phenomenal, and I'm excited to read some of the books you've already written, get to better understand kind of the history beyond what we talked about today. And this is exciting. Love to have you come back on maybe in the future and talk through some more about the work you've been doing. So,
well, and I guess that did raise another question. Once you have this next book wrapped up, what's going to be the next project?
Unknown.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
I've got a lot of other material, but I don't know what to do with it yet. So,
is it still going to be on pheasants, or would you go at another species?
No, it would be pheasants, I'm sure, whatever it would be.
That's really cool.
Awesome. Well, with that, I greatly appreciate your time and time today and your dedication on your books throughout the past. And thank you, sir. It's definitely a neat collection that you put together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Just one closing thoughts and comments here. It's going to be in the book, but I put a page in there to recognize the Nebraska Game Department for what they have done in the past and the present to maintain a pheasant population and continue the tradition for 100 years. And I also put a page in there to recognize Pheasants Forever for what they have done since their creation in the 1980s to promote not only pheasants but other wildlife habitat as well. And I would say in closing that I consider myself an average pheasant hunter, that there are 4 things that the average person who is interested in pheasants can do. To buy a license, because first it provides funds for the game department, but secondly, it also increases the amount of money Nebraska receives through the Pittman-Robertson Act. Secondly, to join Pheasants Forever and support it with whatever level you have the means to do so. To buy a federal waterfowl stamp yearly, because those funds go into habitat, which pheasants use as well, and those areas are open to public hunting. And fourth, to contact your U.S. representative and senators, urge them to support the farm bills and other conservation messages. And Pheasants Forever has made that very easy now, that they will say, okay, you need to contact your congressman, and all you have to do is, click on it basically, and it will send the message that say that you are interested in those programs.
That's really cool. That's awesome.
Very well said.
And thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Oh,
today.
yeah. No, this is great. I really enjoyed this. And I really, to your earlier point, too, a shout out to the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. I work quite a bit with them, and without their support and then all the support of the hunters out there, as you mentioned, with buying hunting permits, that's critical, because I also don't think sometimes that people realize a lot of the habitat management that occurs is because of funds from buying licenses. And so it's really important that we definitely support that. So, yeah, that's great.
Without a doubt. Well, with that, thanks again, Lonnie. We appreciate your time, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Are you enjoying the WildAg Podcast? You or your organization can sponsor upcoming episodes that bring important information to listeners just like you. To learn more, visit our website, go.unl.edu/WildAg. WildAg is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in. And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.